The sun was bleeding out over New Providence, spilling copper light across the weathered stones of the cemetery that stood on the low rise just beyond the last row of buildings. Wind moved through the sage and stirred pale dust between the grave markers, some leaning with age, some still standing straight with names carved deep enough to last another generation. Old Silas Boone stood alone in the center of it all, his back bowed from years bent over livery work, his hat pulled low against the glare, but his eyes steady as iron as he watched the riders come. Royce Maddox sat tall in his saddle at the head of 8 hard-looking men, their horses stepping slow and deliberate over the sacred ground, hooves churning dust over flowers left in tin cups and wilted wreaths laid against carved stone. Royce was young enough to believe his own reputation, cruel enough to enjoy the weight of fear he carried into every town, and arrogant enough to laugh when he saw what Silas held in his weathered hand. The revolver was old, pitted with rust along the barrel and cylinder, the grip scarred and worn smooth by decades of use. And when Royce caught sight of it, he threw back his head and let out a bark of laughter that his men echoed nervously. "Look at this," Royce called out, twisting in his saddle to show his gang the spectacle. "Old man's gonna defend the boneyard with scrap iron." He leaned forward, squinting at the revolver as if examining a museum piece. "That thing probably hasn't fired since Lincoln was alive." The riders chuckled, but their laughter had an edge to it, a careful quality that suggested they knew something their leader didn't. Behind the iron fence that ringed the cemetery, townsfolk had gathered in a tight, silent crowd, hats held against their chests, faces drawn with the kind of fear that comes from watching a man walk toward his own death and being too afraid to stop it. They pressed against the fence, but came no closer, their boots scuffing the dust, their breathing shallow, their eyes fixed on the old liveryman who stood between the graves and the mounted threat bearing down on him. The narrator's voice, low and steady as a man settling into a long story, noted that folks used to say that Rusty Gun had already killed 75 men across the territories, though no one in New Providence had ever seen Silas Boone draw it. The whisper of that number hung in the air like smoke, neither confirmed nor denied, just present enough to make men uneasy when they passed the old stable man on the street. Silas had never spoken of it, never boasted or threatened, never even touched the weapon in public, but the rumor followed him the way shadows follow lamplight, impossible to shake and too persistent to ignore entirely. Royce lifted his reins and urged his horse forward another 3 steps, and the animal's hooves came down square on the wooden marker that bore the name of Silas's wife, grinding it into the dirt with a crack of splitting wood that carried across the cemetery like a rifle shot. The townsfolk flinched as one, and somewhere in the back of the crowd a woman made a small, choked sound of horror. Royce grinned at the reaction, pleased with himself, and let his horse stand there on the broken marker, desecrating the grave with casual, calculated cruelty. Silas's voice came out quiet but clear, carrying the kind of weight that made men stop and listen despite themselves. "You take one more step toward the graves behind me," he said, his thumb resting light on the hammer of that rusty revolver, "and it'll be your last." The riders shifted in their saddles, hands drifting toward the iron on their hips, eyes flicking between their leader and the old man who stood alone and unmoving. Royce's grin widened, showing teeth, and he raised one hand in a lazy signal that brought his men's hands to their gun grips, fingers flexing, leather creaking in the stillness. He was confident this would be the easiest kill of his life, that an old man with a rusted gun and stiff joints wouldn't even clear leather before Royce's bullet found him. And he savored the moment the way a cruel boy savors pulling wings off flies. The last sounds before the shooting started were small and intimate. The creak of saddle leather as weight shifted, the distant tolling of the church bell marking the hour, and Silas's faint breath drawn in through his nose as his thumb eased the hammer back one careful click. Dust motes hung suspended in the dying light, and time seemed to stretch and slow, each second expanding to hold more than it should. The moment balanced on the edge of violence like a coin spinning in the air. Royce's pistol began to clear leather, rising from the holster in a practiced draw that had killed men before, and the rusty revolver in Silas's hand finally began to come up to meet it. How an old man and an old gun ended up facing 8 killers alone in a cemetery at sundown was a question that required going back to the beginning, back to that summer in 1879, when New Providence still felt small and mostly safe, back before Royce Maddox rode in and forced choices that nobody wanted to make. The man telling this story ran the saloon on Main Street and had watched the town grow from 5 buildings and a church bell into a bustling stop on the cattle trail, with telegraph wires humming overhead and new construction hammering away from dawn to dusk. He remembered when Silas Boone first came to town, an old rider who traded his saddle and his wandering life for steady work at the livery and a quiet corner room above the stables. Silas had arrived without fanfare, without stories or boasts, just a weathered man with careful movements and eyes that suggested he'd seen more than he cared to remember. The routine Silas built for himself was simple and repetitive in the way that men seeking peace often arrange their lives. He rose before dawn to brush the horses, moving slowly between the stalls with his coat worn thin at the elbows and his hat pulled low, speaking soft words to the animals that seemed to calm them more than any rough handling ever could. Every Sunday, without fail, he walked to the cemetery to tend the graves of his wife and 2 sons, kneeling on the hard ground to clear weeds and straighten the markers, his rough, scarred hands gentle on the stone. He counted coins at the end of each day with the concentration of a man who had learned to live on little and be grateful for it. And he kept to himself in a way that wasn't unfriendly so much as deliberately removed from the social life of the town. Children were drawn to Silas in the way that children sense kindness beneath weathered faces, trailing after him in the stable yard and peppering him with questions he answered patiently while he worked. Older men watched him with a wariness they couldn't quite explain, a feeling in their gut that this quiet liveryman carried something dangerous under his calm exterior, something that would be better left undisturbed. Every once in a while, someone would notice the old revolver locked in a wooden box near his bed, visible through the open door when they came to settle their stable fees, and the handle of that gun bore faint notches that no one dared ask about, because asking would require an answer they weren't sure they wanted to hear. Travelers occasionally recognized him, usually older men who'd spent time in rougher territories, and when they did, their faces would go still and careful. And they'd mutter something under their breath that sounded like "Reckoner Boone," before paying fast and riding on without making eye contact. The saloon keeper had heard the name spoken that way a few times over the years, always with the same mixture of respect and unease, always followed by a quick departure, and he'd pieced together enough to know that Silas's past involved range wars and posses and shootouts that the old man would never confirm or deny. The town went about its business around him with the steady rhythm of small-town life. Church services on Sundays with hymns drifting through open windows, poker games, and piano music filling the saloon in the evenings, cattle herds passing through in clouds of dust and noise that disrupted everything for a day and then moved on. New Providence was growing, attracting new money and new people, and beneath the surface prosperity there ran an uneasy current that suggested this peace rested on something fragile and unspoken. Some men grew softer with the years, mellowing into grandfathers and storytellers, but Silas Boone had only grown quieter, as if he'd learned that silence was the best way to keep old ghosts at bay. The first real sign that the fragile peace was breaking came on a hot afternoon when Royce Maddox and 6 riders pushed a bawling string of stolen cattle straight down Main Street, turning the orderly little town into chaos with hooves and horns and dust. The animals crashed through water troughs and sent children scrambling for doorways, vendors shouting and dogs barking as the herd swept through like a living flood. Royce sat his horse in the middle of it all, laughing as a frightened steer smashed a vegetable cart into kindling. And when the cart's owner stumbled into the street to protest, Royce rode him down and pistol-whipped him across the face hard enough to break bone, leaving the man bleeding in the dirt while the crowd watched in stunned silence. The saloon filled that evening with nervous energy, packed tight with townsfolk who'd come to see what Royce wanted and to measure the size of the threat he represented. Royce sprawled in a chair by the bar with his boots up on a table and his hat tipped back, refusing to pay for the whiskey he'd poured himself, and he laid out his terms in a voice loud enough to carry to every corner of the room. He represented a powerful cattle outfit. He explained, one that needed a straight trail through town for their herds, and a planned route cut right through the patch of cemetery where some of the oldest graves lay, including the plot where Silas Boone's family rested. By Friday sundown, Royce declared the town would sign over right-of-way and begin clearing the dead out of the trail's way, or he would clear them himself. And the way he said it made clear that this wasn't a negotiation, but an ultimatum with a ticking clock attached. To demonstrate that he meant every word, Royce stepped out into the street and selected a young, stable hand who'd been foolish enough to speak up and protest, dragging him by the collar into the open and beating him methodically while the town watched, fists and boots doing their work until the boy lay curled and bloody in the dust. No one moved to help until Silas stepped out from the livery and placed himself between Royce and the beaten boy, his hands empty and his posture calm but immovable. Royce backhanded him across the face and followed it with a boot to the ribs that sent the old man to his knees, and for a moment it looked like the beating would continue, but then Royce noticed something in Silas's eyes, some quality of stillness that made him hesitate. He noticed, too, the way Silas's hand hung near his belt where a gun would sit, and though Royce laughed it off and stepped back, there was a flicker of unease in his expression that his men caught and filed away. Before riding out to make camp on the edge of town, Royce nailed a crude notice to the church door with a spike and hammer, the paper flapping in the hot wind as a constant reminder that Friday sundown was coming whether the town was ready or not. Some men make their living with cattle, the saloon keeper observed, but Royce Maddox made his with fear, and he was good at his trade. The town fractured in the days that followed, splitting between those ready to give up the graves and move on, those ready to pack up and flee before the violence came, and a very small handful who thought maybe there was another way, though none of them could say exactly what that way might be. Only Silas said quietly, when asked, that the dead would not be moved, and the way he said it carried a finality that made people wonder what the old liveryman might be willing to do to keep that promise. As Friday crept closer, the saloon keeper noticed Silas spending more and more time in the cemetery, walking the rows at dawn and dusk as if he were asking the dead for advice or seeking their permission for something he'd already decided to do. It was during one of those evening walks that the saloon keeper remembered the first time he'd heard Silas's other name, years back, from a U.S. Marshal who'd stopped in town long enough to get drunk and talkative. The Marshal had been half into a bottle when he spotted Silas through the window, and his face had gone pale, and he'd whispered the name Reckoner Boone like it was something dangerous to say out loud. The story the Marshal told that night, slurred and fragmented but clear enough in its essentials, was that Silas Boone had been a government gun after the war, hunting rustlers and bushwhackers through territories where law was barely a suggestion and justice came from the barrel of a gun. The Marshal spoke of towns where men wouldn't say Silas's name above a whisper, of bodies left in dusty streets, and wanted men who'd vanished without a trace, of a reputation built one kill at a time until the count reached a number that nobody could quite believe. 75 men, the Marshal had said, though he couldn't swear to the exact figure and didn't care to guess whether it was higher or lower than that. What had driven Silas to lay down his gun and disappear into quiet obscurity was a tragedy that the Marshal recounted with genuine sorrow. Silas's family had been murdered in a crossfire meant for him, retaliation from men who couldn't touch the reckoner directly, but could reach the people he loved. After that, Silas had walked away from the work, locked up his gun, and spent the rest of his years trying to live small and unnoticed, as if by making himself smaller, he could somehow make amends for the violence he'd brought into the world. The night before the ultimatum was set to expire, Silas climbed the stairs to his small room above the livery and unlocked the wooden box where the rusty revolver had rested untouched for years. He cleaned it with ritual care, running an oiled cloth over the pitted metal, checking the cylinder's action, laying out ammunition with the precision of a man who'd performed this task 1,000 times and knew exactly what each step meant. When he strapped the gun belt around his waist and settled the weight of it on his hip, he stood for a long moment in front of the cracked mirror on his wall, looking at a reflection that showed both who he was now and who he'd been before, and the cost of returning to that older self was written clear in the lines of his face. He moved through town in the hours after that, visiting a small circle of people with requests that seemed random until later, when they all came together into a larger pattern. He asked the saloon keeper for spare lumber and lantern oil, the young Deputy Tom for his help watching certain positions, the undertaker for shovels and rope and a wheeled cart, and the blacksmith for chains strong enough to hold a wagon in place against a hard pull. Each man he spoke to understood without being told that what Silas was planning would likely get some of them killed, and each agreed anyway because the alternative was letting Royce Maddox desecrate their dead and turn the town into something they wouldn't recognize. Word came through the telegraph that Royce was expecting 4 more hired guns on the evening train 2 days after the ultimatum, which meant that if they didn't break him now, at the moment he'd chosen, the town would be lost under a boot heel that would only press harder with time. Silas explained his reasoning for choosing the cemetery as the battleground in a way that made tactical sense to anyone who'd ever thought about fighting. Stone markers and iron fences made better cover than open street. The terrain could be shaped and prepared in ways that favored defenders. And most importantly, he'd rather the dead watch him do what needed doing than have the living stand in the line of fire and get cut down for their trouble. He walked the saloon keeper through the plan with the calm precision of a man who'd fought enough battles to know that preparation mattered more than bravery. The undertaker would leave one grave freshly dug in a position that offered cover and a clean line of fire. The blacksmith would chain a wagon across the main approach to create a bottleneck that would force attackers into a narrow killing ground. And young Deputy Tom would take position in the church tower with the bell rope in hand, ready to give one long peal as a signal when Royce crossed the line Silas would mark in the dirt. It was a plan built for men who understood they might not walk away from it, and the weight of that knowledge sat heavy in the room as they discussed angles and positions and contingencies. When the meeting broke up and the others had gone to their tasks, Silas walked alone to the cemetery and knelt at his family's graves, resting one weathered hand on his wife's stone marker. And he made a promise in a voice too low for anyone else to hear that this would be the last time he killed for them, the last time he strapped on the gun and became the reckoner, and that after this he would rest the way they rested, done with violence and the debts it created. The morning of the ultimatum dawned with an eerie quiet that made the town feel like it was holding its breath. Streets mostly empty and shutters half closed, distant cattle lowing in the pens, and the church bell tolling slow and measured like a countdown to something inevitable. The saloon keeper wondered, as he checked a rifle he'd hidden under the bar and tried to steady his hands, whether an old gunfighter's mind and a rusty gun could really turn back men who lived by violence and had no reason to believe they could lose, and what would happen if the plan failed and the cemetery ended up holding more dead than any of them had intended to bury. A reckoner's job, Silas had said the night before, wasn't to outdraw death, but to tally what must be paid, and the payment coming due at sundown was going to be measured in blood and broken stone and choices that couldn't be unmade. Sundown found Royce Maddox riding back toward New Providence with 8 men instead of the 6 he'd brought before, 2 fresh guns having joined him from the trail with rifles resting easy across their saddles and the confidence of men who'd never met serious resistance. The townsfolk had been warned to stay back, and they gathered at the iron fence around the cemetery exactly as they would later, in the moment that opened this story, pressed against the barrier and too frightened to move, but unable to look away from what was about to happen. Royce was smug as he approached the cemetery gate, seeing only an old man standing among scattered stones and wooden markers, completely unaware of the preparations that had turned the graveyard into something other than what it appeared to be. The wagon choke point looked like abandoned equipment, the open grave looked like routine undertaker's work, and the positions where Deputy Tom and the others waited were invisible to eyes that saw only what they expected to see. Silas called out one last time, his voice carrying across the evening air with the kind of clarity that comes from absolute certainty that the dead were not moving and that Royce should turn back while he still could. Royce answered by spurring his horse forward over the line Silas had scratched in the dirt that morning, crossing the boundary with deliberate contempt, and the church bell tolled once, long and heavy, the sound rolling across the town like thunder. The first shots cracked the air with sudden violence that shattered the tension. Silas's rusty revolver spoke and put a bullet through the lead rider's shoulder, spinning him from his saddle in a spray of blood, while Deputy Tom's rifle barked from behind the low stone wall and shattered another man's arm at the elbow. Royce's men dismounted fast and spread out between the grave markers, using the stones for cover as they returned fire, and bullets began to slam into carved names and chip pieces from marble and granite, ricochets whining off iron fence posts. The saloon keeper crouched behind the chained wagon with extra ammunition laid out beside him, heart hammering in his chest as he watched Silas move with an economy of motion that didn't match his age, each shot placed with the kind of precision that came from decades of practice and an understanding that wasted bullets meant wasted lives. A thrown lantern shattered near the pile of lumber they'd soaked in oil, and flames erupted with a whoosh that sent up a wall of fire and smoke, forcing Royce's men to bunch together exactly where Silas had predicted they would, exactly where the crossfire could reach them. Deputy Tom was hit in the leg and went down hard, dragging himself behind cover while the undertaker fired from below ground level in the open grave, his position giving him angles that the attackers couldn't easily counter. One by one, the overconfident riders charged through the bottleneck created by the chain wagon and met Silas's measure response. Each shot fired like a man counting debts and making sure the ledger balanced. No hurry and no hesitation, just the mechanical work of killing that Silas had tried so hard to leave behind. When only Royce and two men remained standing, a townsman broke from the fence in a rush of rage or courage or panic, ignoring every warning Silas had given about staying clear, and charged into the fight with nothing but his fists and his fury. He died badly, cut down by crossfire before he made it 10 steps, and his death threw the careful plan into chaos just long enough for Royce to see an opening and take it. Royce circled wide while the defenders were distracted, flanking the wagon and putting a bullet into Silas's side that sent the old man to one knee, blood spreading dark across his shirt. For the first time since the shooting started, the legend looked like it might fall, and the saloon keeper felt his stomach drop as he watched Silas struggle to stay upright, the rusty revolver suddenly heavy in his hand. But Silas didn't fall, and after a moment that seemed to stretch longer than it should, he pushed himself back to his feet and stepped deliberately away from cover, leaving the protection of the wagon and the stones and walking out into the open ground between his family's graves. It was an invitation and a challenge both, stripping away all the tactics and preparation and reducing the fight to its simplest terms. Two men, their guns, and the weight of their choices. Royce took the bait because men like him always did, because his pride wouldn't let him shoot a man in the back when he could kill him face to face and make a story of it. He walked towards Silas through the scattered stones and the bodies of his fallen men, and when he reached the family plot, he made a show of spitting on the marker that bore Silas's wife's name, a final insult meant to provoke and humiliate. The town held its breath as the two men faced each other in the dying light, Royce's hand hovering over his pistol and a grin on his face that suggested he still believed this would end with him walking away. A young man trusts his speed, the saloon keeper thought, but an old one trusts what speed has already cost him, and what it had cost Silas Boone was everything he'd ever cared about, and 75 lives he couldn't take back. Royce's hand dropped toward his gun, and Silas moved, and the rusty revolver that folks said hadn't been drawn in years came up smooth and certain and spoke once more with the authority of all the years it had been silent. Royce fell backward across the grave he'd just desecrated, a small hole in his chest that the last light caught for only a heartbeat, and then he was still, the 76th man to fall to that pitted, rust-scarred piece of iron. The gunshots faded into ringing silence, and the saloon keeper found himself standing in a cemetery that had become a battlefield, smoke drifting between shattered stones and bodies sprawled where they'd fallen. Silas stood over Royce's corpse with the revolver sagging in his hand, smoke curling from the barrel like a final breath from an old ghost. And then his legs gave out, and he sank to his knees beside his wife's grave, the strength that had carried him through the fight finally used up. The wounded on both sides groaned and called for help, and townsfolk began to climb over the fence now that the shooting had stopped, moving cautiously through the aftermath of violence that had seemed impossible right up until it happened. A dead townsman lay where his impulsive charge had ended. Deputy Tom bled from his leg wound, but would survive, and scattered among the stones were 8 hired guns who'd ridden into New Providence expecting an easy payday, and found instead that some old men and some old guns still remembered how to make their warnings count. By the saloon keeper's tally, Royce made 76 men laid low by that rusty gun, though he supposed the exact count didn't matter as much as what the count represented. A lifetime of violence that Silas had tried to escape and finally couldn't, a debt called due one last time in defense of people who couldn't defend themselves. The cattle outfit sent a telegram 2 days later, but when word came back that a man called the Reckoner still lived in New Providence and that the town had buried 8 hired guns without flinching, no more riders appeared on the trail. Royce's employers decided there were easier paths to drive their cattle in smaller towns to intimidate, places where the dead didn't have anyone willing to stand between them and desecration. Silas survived his wound through the careful attention of the town doctor and the prayers of people who'd never spoken more than a few words to him before, but now understood what he'd done and why. He recovered slowly in his small room above the livery, and when he was strong enough to walk again, he wrapped the rusty revolver in oilcloth and brought it to the saloon keeper with instructions to hide it where no easy hand could find it, someplace where it could rest the way he intended to rest, done with the work of killing. The town voted quietly to fence the cemetery with new iron and stone, better and stronger than what had been there before. And for the first time in years, Silas's wife and son's names were carved deep and clean into proper markers that would last. The contrast between the forgotten, leaning stones of the past and the freshly tended graves showed how the community had learned what it cost to have something worth protecting and how much harder it was to protect it than to simply let it go. Years passed, and the saloon keeper kept the story alive the way good stories are kept in small towns, telling it to travelers who asked about the well-tended cemetery on the hill and the quiet old man who ran the livery. He told it from behind his bar with the lamplight soft and the revolver resting unseen in a drawer, letting the legend do more work than the gun ever would again, because some stories carried more weight than the iron that inspired them. Silas lived out his remaining years in the same quiet way he'd lived before the standoff, rising before dawn to tend horses and walking to the cemetery every Sunday. Though now children followed him more openly, and men tipped their hats with genuine respect rather than uncertain wariness. He never spoke of the gunfight or the men he'd killed or the legend that grew up around that rusty revolver. And when people thanked him for what he'd done, he simply nodded and went back to his work because talking about violence had never been his way. When the saloon keeper finished telling the story to yet another stranger leaning against his bar, he always ended with the same question, posed more to himself than to his listener. Was it the revolver that killed 76 men, or was it the man who finally decided enough was enough, who drew the line between the living and the dead and refused to let it be crossed? The answer, he supposed, didn't matter as much as the asking, because the question itself was what turned a gunfight in a cemetery into something larger. A story worth remembering about the cost of peace and the weight of choices, and the moment when a quiet man decided that some things were worth breaking his silence for. Guns don't grow old, the saloon keeper would say as he wiped down his bar and prepared to close for the night. But the men who carry them do, and some live just long enough to put them away. And that act of putting them away, that final choice to rest rather than reach, might be the bravest thing a dangerous man can do.